Anthony Hopkins was cleaning out a house he no longer lived in when he found the drawer that changed everything. It was November 2019, and Hopkins had returned to his old home in London, a Georgian townhouse in Kensington that he'd owned since the late 1980s, but hadn't properly visited in years. He was preparing to sell it, finally letting go of a property that had become more museum than home, filled with artifacts from decades of a life he sometimes barely recognized as his own. The estate agent had suggested he sort through personal items before the staging team arrived. "Anything you want to keep," she'd said cheerfully, "best take it now." So Hopkins found himself alone in his old study on a gray Tuesday afternoon, opening drawers he hadn't touched in 20 years. The bottom drawer of the mahogany desk stuck when he pulled it. He had to yank twice before it gave way, releasing a smell of old paper and something faintly metallic, the scent of time itself compressed into a small wooden space. Inside was a manila folder, thick with envelopes, held together by a rubber band that had long since perished into brittle fragments. On the folder's tab, in his own handwriting from another era, were 4 words that stopped his heart. "Letters I never answered." Hopkins sat down heavily in the old leather chair. He opened the folder, and there, on the very top of the stack, was a yellowed envelope postmarked March 17, 1993. The return address was in Bristol. The handwriting was a child's, careful, deliberate, the letters formed with the concentration of someone who had been taught that penmanship mattered. Hopkins slid the letter from its envelope with hands that had begun, very slightly, to tremble. What he read in the next 3 minutes would send him on a journey he never expected, a journey to find a stranger and finally answer a question that had waited 26 years for a response. To understand why that folder existed at all, you have to understand what 1993 was like for Anthony Hopkins. He had won the Academy Award for The Silence of the Lambs in March 1992, an award that transformed him overnight from respected character actor to international phenomenon. Suddenly, the man who had spent decades in relative anonymity was the most talked-about actor in the world. His face was everywhere. His voice was imitated at parties. His portrayal of Hannibal Lecter had become a cultural touchstone that would define him for the rest of his life. The fame was overwhelming, and with the fame came the letters. They arrived by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Fan mail from every country, every demographic, every conceivable motivation. People who loved him, people who feared him, people who confused him with the character he'd played, people who wanted autographs, photographs, money, advice, marriage, salvation. Hopkins tried to answer them at first. He'd always believed in courtesy, in acknowledging the people who took time to reach out. But the volume was impossible. His assistant sorted the mail into categories: press requests, business inquiries, general fan mail, and a special pile for letters that seemed to require personal attention. That special pile grew faster than Hopkins could address it. Letters accumulated. Weeks became months. And somewhere in the chaos of a career that had suddenly exploded beyond all recognition, a manila folder was created, a holding place for letters that deserved answers but never received them. The folder was placed in the bottom drawer of his desk with the intention that he would return to it when things calmed down. Things never calmed down. The letter from Bristol was written by a 12-year-old boy named Daniel Marsh. Hopkins read it 3 times in that empty study, the November light fading around him, before he fully absorbed what the child had written. Daniel explained that he had been acting since he was 8, school plays, local theater, a few small television appearances. He loved it more than anything. When he was on stage, he wrote, he felt like he was finally the person he was supposed to be. But something had changed. His father had lost his job. Money was tight. The family was moving to a smaller house in a different town, and there would be no more drama classes, no more auditions, no more theater. Daniel's teacher had suggested he write to someone who might understand, someone who had also come from nothing and made it anyway. Someone who could tell him whether it was worth holding on to a dream that everyone around him said was impractical. "I watched you in that movie where you play the scary man," Daniel wrote. "My mom said I was too young to see it, but I watched it at my friend's house. You were so good at pretending to be someone else. I want to be that good someday." But my dad says acting isn't a real job and I should focus on things that matter. Do you think I should quit? Did you ever want to quit? How did you know you were? How? Supposed to keep going? Please write back. I don't have anyone else to ask. The letter was signed with a child's careful signature. Daniel Marsh, age 12. Hopkins sat in the darkening study for a long time after he finished reading. He thought about all the years that letter had waited in that drawer. He thought about a 12-year-old boy checking the mail day after day, waiting for an answer that never came. And he thought about what that boy might have become in the 26 years since. Finding Daniel Marsh in 2019 was easier than Hopkins expected. A few phone calls to his assistant, a bit of careful research, and within a week, Hopkins had an address in Manchester and a basic outline of what had happened to the boy who had written to him in 1993. Daniel Marsh had not become an actor. He had studied accounting at university, worked for a large firm in Birmingham for 15 years, then moved to Manchester to be closer to his aging parents. He was married with 2 children. He worked in financial consulting. He was, by all external measures, successful and stable. But there was one detail that caught Hopkins's attention. Daniel Marsh was also the founder and volunteer director of a small youth theater program in his neighborhood, an after-school initiative that provided free drama classes to children from low-income families. Hopkins read that detail 3 times. Then he picked up the phone. The call came on a Wednesday evening in late November 2019. Daniel Marsh was in his home office, reviewing spreadsheets, when his wife appeared in the doorway with an odd expression on her face. "There's someone on the phone for you," she said. "He says his name is Anthony Hopkins." Daniel laughed. "Very funny. Which of my friends put you up to this?" "Daniel." His wife's voice was strange. "I don't think it's a joke." Daniel took the phone with the skepticism of a man who had learned long ago to distrust anything that seemed too good to be true. "Hello? Is this Daniel Marsh?" The voice on the other end was unmistakable. That precise diction, that faint Welsh musicality, the voice that had haunted a generation's nightmares and dreams. "Yes," Daniel managed. "This is Daniel." "Daniel, my name is Anthony Hopkins. I'm calling because I owe you an apology that's 26 years overdue." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Hopkins explained about the drawer, the folder, the letter he had found. He read portions of it back to Daniel, who had long since forgotten the exact words he had written as a desperate 12-year-old. "I should have answered you then," Hopkins said. "I have no excuse except the chaos of that time in my life. But that's not really an excuse at all, is it? You were a child who needed guidance, and I failed you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Sir Anthony, Mr. Hopkins, I need to tell you something. I checked the mail every day for 2 years after I sent that letter. Every single day. When no answer came, I thought it meant something. I thought it meant I wasn't worth responding to, that I wasn't good enough." Hopkins closed his eyes. "I quit acting the summer I turned 14, Daniel continued, "not because of my family's finances. We eventually recovered from that. I quit because I decided you were right not to answer. I decided that your silence was the answer, that I should stop dreaming about impossible things and focus on a real career." "Daniel," Hopkins said quietly, "I never received your letter until 3 weeks ago. It was buried in a drawer I hadn't opened in decades. My silence wasn't a judgment. It was a failure. My failure, not yours." "I know that now," Daniel said. "Rationally, I've known it for years. But there's a 12-year-old inside me who never quite believed it." What Hopkins said next would stay with Daniel Marsh for the rest of his life. "Daniel, I want to answer your letter, properly, the way I should have answered it 26 years ago. May I?" Daniel found himself nodding, though Hopkins couldn't see him. "Yes," he whispered. "Please." Hopkins took a breath. "You asked me if you should quit. The answer is no. You should never quit something you love because other people think it's impractical. The world is full of practical people doing practical things, and most of them are miserable because they abandoned the impractical dreams that made them feel alive." He paused. "You asked if I ever wanted to quit. The answer is yes, hundreds of times. I wanted to quit when I couldn't get work, when critics savaged me, when I looked in the mirror and saw a failure staring back. I wanted to quit when I was drinking myself to death and couldn't see any future worth living for. But I didn't quit. Not because I was brave or special, but because I couldn't imagine being anyone other than what I was. An actor, a pretender, someone who felt most real when inhabiting someone else's story. That's not a choice. It's a compulsion. And if you feel it too, no amount of practical advice will ever make it go away. Hopkins's voice softened. You asked how I knew I was supposed to keep going. The truth is, I never knew. I still don't know. I've spent my entire career terrified that someone would discover I had no idea what I was doing. But I've learned that not knowing is part of the work. Certainty is for accountants and engineers. Artists live in doubt. We make things in the dark and hope they find the light. He paused again. Daniel, you run a theater program for children. You give them what nobody gave me, a safe place to pretend, to transform, to discover who they might become. You didn't quit acting. You just found a different stage, and I suspect you've changed more lives from that stage than I ever have from mine. Daniel Marsh was crying by the time Hopkins finished. Not the restrained tears of a grown man protecting his dignity, but the deep, releasing sobs of a 12-year-old boy who had finally received the letter he'd been waiting for all his life. I've spent 26 years believing I gave up, Daniel said when he could speak again. Believing I failed. Believing I wasn't strong enough to keep the dream alive. You didn't give up, Hopkins said firmly. You adapted. There's a difference. Giving up means the dream dies. Adapting means the dream finds a new form. You're still in theater, Daniel. You're just in the wings instead of center stage, and the wings are where the real work happens. They talked for another hour after that, about Daniel's children, about Hopkins's painting, about the strange paths that lives take when we're not paying attention. By the end of the call, something had shifted in Daniel Marsh. Something that had been clenched tight for decades had finally relaxed. Thank you, Daniel said as they prepared to hang up. I don't know how to thank you properly. You can thank me by doing one thing, Hopkins said. Or anything. The next time a child in your program writes a letter to someone they admire, make sure they know that the answer, whether it comes or not, says nothing about their worth. Tell them that the people they admire are just as lost as everyone else. Tell them that the only opinion that matters is their own. Anthony Hopkins didn't just make that phone call and move on. 3 months later, in February 2020, he traveled to Manchester. He visited Daniel Marsh's youth theater program, a converted community center where 40 children gathered twice a week to learn the fundamentals of performance. Hopkins spent the entire afternoon there. He watched rehearsals. He answered questions. He sat in a circle with children who had no idea who he was, children who were too young to have seen his famous films, and talked about what it meant to pretend, to become someone else, to find courage and imagination. At the end of the session, he asked if anyone had a piece of paper and a pen. A small girl, no more than 9, offered him a notebook. Hopkins wrote for several minutes, then tore out the page and handed it to Daniel. Read it to them, Hopkins said. When I'm gone. The letter was simple. It said, To the young actors of the Marsh Theater program, someone believed in you enough to create this place, that someone was once a boy who wrote a letter and never received an answer. He could have let that silence define him. Instead, he built something that answers every child who has ever wondered if their dreams matter. Your dreams matter. Your voices matter. The stories you tell, even the small ones, even the ones nobody else sees, they matter. Keep pretending, keep transforming, keep finding yourselves in the characters you become. With admiration, Anthony Hopkins. The story of Anthony Hopkins and Daniel Marsh never became public. Neither of them sought attention for it. But the ripples of that phone call, that visit, that 26-year delayed answer, continued to spread in quiet ways. Daniel Marsh expanded his theater program after Hopkins's visit. Funding that had been difficult to secure suddenly became available, not because Hopkins intervened directly, but because Daniel finally had the confidence to ask for it. He began speaking at education conferences about the importance of arts programs for underprivileged children. He stopped apologizing for his impractical hobby. and he stopped thinking of himself as someone who had given up. For 26 years, I carried a story about myself, Daniel said in a rare interview about his program in 2022. A story that said I wasn't good enough, wasn't brave enough, wasn't special enough to pursue what I loved. It took one phone call to realize that story was never true. I didn't abandon theater. I just found a different way to serve it. Hopkins, for his part, made one change to his daily routine after finding that drawer full of unanswered letters. Every Sunday morning, before anything else, he now writes 3 handwritten responses to fan mail, prioritizing letters from young people, from aspiring artists, from anyone who sounds like they need to hear that their dreams matter. I can't answer them all, he admitted in 2021, but I can answer some, and maybe one of those letters will reach someone at exactly the moment they need it. The story of the drawer and the letter reminds us that our silences have weight. Every unanswered message, every ignored request, every moment when we're too busy or too overwhelmed to respond, these absences create stories in other people's minds, stories about their worth, stories about whether they matter, stories that can shape entire lives. Anthony Hopkins found a 26-year-old letter from a child who needed help, and he discovered that his silence had told a story he never intended to tell. So he picked up the phone 3 decades late and told a different one. It's never too late to answer the letters we should have answered. It's never too late to correct the stories our silences have written. The people who needed to hear from us years ago, some of them are still waiting, still wondering, still checking the mail. Hopkins could have looked at that yellowed envelope, felt the appropriate guilt, and closed the drawer. Instead, he made a phone call that reached across 26 years to tell a middle-aged man what a 12-year-old boy had desperately needed to hear. You are worth answering. Your dreams are worth protecting. And the silence of the people you admire says nothing about who you are. If this hidden chapter of Anthony Hopkins's life moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to answer, to reach out, to correct an old silence with a new voice. Have you ever received a response you'd given up hoping for? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that reveal who our heroes really are.